to the spread of the gospel back in the first century. So, saying that, recognizing their importance, God still limits them in some areas. The Scriptures place some limitations upon women. Really the Scriptures place limitations upon us all in certain areas, but this, when it comes to the roles of men and women, there are things that we have, some obligations, some restrictions that each of us have. And so when we get to women, this is one of them. And there are some limitations. The Scriptures clearly teach these. It's clearly taught in this passage. And it's also taught again to Paul's letter to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, where it says, "Let a woman learn in silence with all submission, and I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence." And so here we find another very clear passage, something that's really simple. It's not hard to understand. And so we put both of these together and we can draw some very obvious conclusions. And so to begin with, we need to look at, what does this require? What does this require out of women? Well, very simply, it states there, let your women keep silence. Keep silent. Paul says in verse 34, for they are not permitted to speak. Let your women keep silent, for they are not permitted to speak. He even goes as far as to say not even to ask questions. Because there in verse 35 it says, and if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home. For it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. And so, let your women keep silent. It's a shame for them to speak. They're not even to ask questions. They are to be as the tongue speaker without an interpreter. He was limited there. If you remember what we studied there in verse 28, where it says, if there's no interpreter, let him keep silent in church and let him speak to himself and to God. And so if you remember when we studied that back a couple of weeks ago, here you have this man that has the ability to speak in tongues, but there's no one there that can interpret what he's saying, then he is to keep silent. He is not to say anything. He's not to perform that gift of speaking in tongues. He's to keep it to himself and to God. And so this is the same thing. Women are not permitted to speak in the congregation. Those who are able to speak in tongues but yet have no interpreter, they are not permitted to speak as well. And so, without a doubt, I believe this is what God is requiring for women to remain silent. The next thing we can look at is reasons why this applies today. A lot of people will come up and they'll say, well, that was then, this is now. This doesn't apply today. But what we need to look at is, why does this apply today? Why does this apply today?
God commanded it.
God commanded it. Paul says, it's a shame. It's a shame. There in the last part of verse 35, it says, for it is shameful for women to speak in church. So the reason God has commanded it is not because it was a custom of the day. It's because it's a shame. For it is a shame for women to speak in church. So nothing is mentioned about any cultural issues there. And when you really go back and look at the culture there in Corinth, everything that was going on there, if you remember back several months ago, our introduction to Corinthians, and we were looking at the city and all of the religions, the false religions, and the idolatry and things of that nature that were in Corinth. You had priestesses. You had female religious leaders in Corinth. And so for women to speak out in the congregation there would not necessarily have been something that went against the culture of Corinth at that time. And so the cultural argument really doesn't add up when you look at, what was going on at that time. The reason is because it's a shame. It's not a cultural shame, it's a spiritual shame, as even taught in the law of Moses. But they are to be submissive, as the law also says. So this is going back, this is not something that's just there during that time at Corinth. This goes all the way back to the law. It's a shame for a woman to take this leading part. Here Paul makes a specific application by appealing to a general principle. The general principle is that it's shameful for women to speak in church. It's shameful for women to speak over men, so to speak, in other areas. But the specific application is they are told to be silent and to ask their husbands at home. The general principle remains true even if the specific circumstances are not present. Women are still to be submissive. That still applies today. Now there again, you'll have people that will try to make that a cultural or maybe limit that because of time and things like that. But therefore, we have no authorization to do that. There's no reason to do that. Women are still to be submissive. They are still not to teach or have authority over a man. And so this principle applies whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Corinth, whether it's in Asia, at Ephesus, or other places, or today in the United States of America. This applies. This command is rooted in principles which go back to the very beginning. Let's go again to 1 Timothy chapter 2, and we'll read through verses 14. It says, "Let a woman learn in silence with all submission, and I do not permit a woman to speak or have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression." And then we go back to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16. It says, "To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception and pain. You shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." And so this command, again, is not rooted in any cultural thing or anything relevant to the age there. When Paul was writing to the Corinthians, it really goes back all the way to the beginning. All the way back to Adam and Eve. That's the basis. And so any cultural argument that somebody can make, really, it doesn't hold water. Because it's not rooted in culture. It's rooted in God's commands. It's rooted in, things that He set forth at the very beginning as a result of the sin that the first man and first woman committed. And you can see it all throughout the Scriptures. And none of these things have changed. Again, we are dealing with a command of God and not Paul's personal bias. As Paul makes clear, if we continue reading there in verses 36 through 38, it says, "Or did the word of God come originally from you? Or was it you only that it reached? If anyone thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things which I write to you are the commandments of the Lord. But if anyone is ignorant, let him be ignorant." So these things that Paul was writing to the Corinthians are not his opinions. They are not his beliefs. They are not his preferences. They are not just fill in the blank. They are the commandments of the Lord. This is what God was telling them and in turn telling us. So by taking into account the immediate context of the passage, as well as context from other passages which are still applicable today, we can see that this still applies today. To write these passages off as the ravings of a chauvinist, or to just very simply disregard the authority of the Scriptures. And to do so is a very dangerous thing. And we need to be very careful when we start trying to rationalize and try to promote things or promote modern ideas and modern things that go against the Scripture. Yes, Doug.
I was just thinking what you just said. I forgot exactly how you said it. But there's not many preachers, teachers, not anybody who go along with 3:16, Genesis 3:16, where and let him be the rule over her.
Yeah.
That is just absolutely gone from the churches now, as far as I know. I mean, the women would really hate the fact that they couldn't tell their husbands what to do. Many of them.
Yeah. As we said in the beginning, this restriction is not a commentary on a woman's ability to contribute to the worship service. I believe many women do have an ability to contribute, but it's just simply not God's plan. This is the same as the fourth prophet. You remember we studied a couple of weeks ago how, if you have, several prophets in the congregation, only 2 or 3 should prophesy during a service. Does that mean the fourth prophet didn't have anything worth saying or didn't have anything that might contribute to the worship service? Well, if it's a prophecy, I would think it would be worth saying. But God limits that. He limits him. And, for the fourth prophet to get mad because, he thinks that that everybody's saying that he doesn't have the ability or anything to contribute to the worship service, it's just to disregard God's instructions. That's his plan. And so we must follow the plan. Then we ask the question, well, when are the women to keep silent? So let's know what Paul says there in 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 34. The first part says, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for it is shameful for women to speak in church." There in the last part of verse 35, it says, "For it is shameful for women to speak in church." So the place is in the church, or literally in the assembly, when the congregation is assembled. And so when we look at the context of what he's talking about here, and if you can remember, this comes right on the heels of what we were talking about last week as far as those who were speaking in tongues or had the ability to speak in tongues, and then those who had the ability to prophesy. This is during the assembly worship of the congregation. If we back up to the first part of verse 23, it says, "Therefore, if the whole church comes together in one place." And so, this is the entire congregation coming together in one place. These are the rules that should govern that assembly. And so then he goes down and he speaks of, those who are able to speak in tongues, those who are able to prophesy, and then he comes to this section as far as the women taking a part in the assembly worship. And so we need to understand the context and what is being said there as far as where women are to keep silent. This is not necessarily at home. There again, we look at verse 35, where is, if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home. And so there is a time and a place for women to ask and things of that nature. So what we get here is this principle applies to whenever the whole church comes together in one place. Does anybody have any comments or anything so far?
Shane, I'd like for you to elaborate a little bit upon the women speaking in this venue that we have now.
Okay, my plans are after we get through with all this, I'm gonna go over different scenarios and discuss those scenarios. So I do plan to do that there. Any other comments or anything here? The question that was asked of me last week, and it's a very good question, one that I'm very happy to address, is, well, what if a woman doesn't have a husband to ask? And so this is not a hypothetical question. This is a question that women sitting in this building today have to deal with, and it's a good question, and one that we need to have a proper answer for. This same question could be asked of a woman maybe who does not have a husband that is a Christian. She has a husband, but he's a non-Christian. And so, therefore she really doesn't have a husband that she can ask. Or maybe she has a husband that is a Christian, but maybe for some reason or another, he doesn't want to answer her questions. And so, you have women who find themselves in positions to where, they don't have someone at home to ask a question. So the question is she condemned to live in ignorance? Can she not get answers to what she needs? We noticed earlier last week, I believe, and then I put it up the slide this week as well, didn't actually mention it, but where the older women are to teach the younger women. And so an integral part of teaching would be answering questions that a student might have. And so here you have maybe a younger woman who has a question. I believe it's the duty of older women to help her answer those questions. And so I believe there we have a principle where a woman could go to another woman and discuss these things. And so as we said before, there are women in this building who possess more knowledge than I do. And so, they could help other women as far as answering questions, because we see where it's the obligation of older women to help younger women, to teach them, to answer their questions. When I think about this as well, I was thinking about it all week, and I was also reminded of Christ's conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. Here you have Christ in this situation where he's on a one-on-one situation with another woman. He's standing with her at the well. They're conversing. She asked about his reasons for him speaking to a Samaritan woman. And so therefore there's this discourse, there's this back and forth between them. He uses that question as an opportunity to explain some very important things to her. And so, the question is, well, was it wrong for her to ask the question of Christ? I don't think it was. I think he would have condemned her. He condemned her for some things there. But asking him a question wasn't one of them. And so there, I think we have the basis for, a woman going and asking someone, a knowledgeable man, a question. Because this woman was doing so with Christ. All Christians are obligated to learn and to increase their knowledge. I'm reminded of Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 through 17. It says, "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Therefore do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is." So it's incumbent upon us, upon us all, to seek answers to questions that we might have. And I believe God provides a way for women to do that outside of an assembly worship. In that, they can ask other women, and they can even ask other men, I believe, as long as those things are done in the proper manner, according to what we were reading there in 1 Timothy chapter 2, as well as other places. They must conduct themselves in a proper manner. We've said before, in order to understand sometimes what a passage means, we might first need to look at, well, what can this passage not mean? And I believe this is one of those instances where we can do that. We can go and we can look at these other principles, other passages, and we can say, well, it was all right for her to do that. It says here that they can do this. And so obviously this passage is not contradicting those things, so it can't mean that. And so I believe we can do that with this passage as well. We must also take into account the context of the statement. The statement here, let her ask her husband at home. Well, what was the issue being discussed? The issue being discussed was women speaking out in the assembly. And so, look at the context. She must keep silent in the assembly. That's the conclusion. She must be submissive. But as long as she is doing those things, I believe these other passages prove that she can seek for information elsewhere. And so I don't think this is said in an effort to limit a woman getting information from anyone other than her husband. Any comments or anything along those lines?
My uncle is an elder now. I don't think he's a qualified elder, but he's an elder, and he teaches that women can't talk in the church, Bible class, or anything. And I said, well, you violate that all the time, just yourself. And he said, well, no, I don't. He said, my wife has something, she waits and asks me at home. I says, but when the little young lady that you're an elder over asked you a Bible question, what do? You don't answer her? See, she ain't got a husband to ask. She asked you. You answer it all the time. I've been with you when you've asked. See, that's the mess you get in when you try, misunderstanding what the passage says, I appreciate what you...
all the time people try to, they take passages out of context and a lot of the time it's become because they want to do more. But we can go the other end too, and we can limit something that's not limited by not looking at the context, not looking at the bigger picture, and like he said, just bring in and fully understand the issue there. So we can't be guilty of binding things that are not bound.
Just for the benefit of everyone, I believe, Shane, that the principle is when God specifies something. See, that's really, he says husband, but we go to the upper room where they broke bread, and one rule of interpretation, would demand that you go through, and if the specific is necessary and all that, then we apply. It's binding. The upper room, brethren have always tried to get us on the Lord's Supper by saying, well, you can't create that because they met in an upper room. And we say, yeah, but it's not necessary. It's specified.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening there with ask your husband. He's just giving an alternative. Yeah. He's meaning away from the assembly. Yeah. He said at home, but she can't ask him in the car on the way home.
Yeah.
See, like home, you can tell he's not trying to bind at the house, and he's not trying to bind the husband. What he's wanting is for her to be quiet in the assembly, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions there? So that kind of finishes up what I have to say as far as, what the scriptures say and what I believe it says. And so now I want to kind of shift to some applications. Before we shift there, does anybody agree or disagree or anything with what we've said so far? Because it's very important before we get into applications that we all understand where we're at. Yeah.
Shane, we know, with what you said, I agree, what Rod said, I do too, but we know that when the Lord commands us to do something, if a woman doesn't have a husband, there is other ways. She's not gonna have a question she can't get an answer to from someone. We certainly know the Lord allows. He would allow it.
All right. Anything else? All right. So what bearing might all of this have on some different situations? One situation being a Bible class where the entire church is present. And, we recently went through several months where we had Bible classes on Sunday and Wednesday where everybody was in here together. The entire church was present. It was a Bible class, but everybody was here. To me, it would require that women keep silent. So even though we might not term that as an assembly worship, the church is together, everybody's present. And so if a woman was to address those gathered, she would be addressing the church. And so I think the principles that we have read here in 1 Corinthians there would prohibit her from doing so. Everybody agree, disagree? Any questions, comments?
I agree with what you say, but so many that profess to be have read but seem like do not understand that. They think that as long as you call it a Bible class, that a woman can speak. But you have to understand what you're saying. If the whole church has come together into one place, whether it's a Bible class or whether it's to assemble, the whole church has come together. That's the assembly.
Yeah.
And therefore the rules of what we're studying here apply. But like I said, there's so many that just cannot make that distinction. They think, well, no, it's not an assembly, it's a Bible class. But again, if the whole church has come together, it's the assembly.
I think that's right. I'll give you one example. This was an example that I was going to bring up, and this was Brandy worshiped at a congregation a month or so ago on a Sunday evening. They come in, they, just like a normal assembly worship, they start, they have Bible reading, they sing songs, they pray. The preacher, instead of getting up at the podium, he comes down, I think he sits or something like that, down here in the front. He says, well, we're gonna do things, we're gonna have a little class here, and I want Sister so-and-so to read our passage that we're going to discuss.
Shane, I've had 2 or 3 cases where I call that, where I know the whole church is there.
Yeah.
The woman will read out during the Bible. It was a Bible class, but the whole church was assembled there.
Yeah.
And that's the way we should all do. Get those people to learn what they're supposed to not.
And so there, it's just like what Brother Hall said. It's just you have the whole assembly there. Now he may say, okay, now we're having a Bible class. But the church is there. Any woman speaking out is going to be addressing the assembly. And so therefore, I believe that is wrong. That is a violation of these things that we have discussed. Any other comments?
Shane?
Yeah.
It's made, well, let me just ask you. The whole church, that's like, this morning, we know this is Bible class, the whole church will be together here in a few minutes.
Mhm.
Now, that's, and I certainly don't want to take anything away from it, but, you know, that doesn't mean that you don't have somebody that's not here this morning. The whole church still come together, brother so-and-so, whoever,
Yeah.
don't mean no disrespect, may not be here, but the whole church is still coming together. So it doesn't mean that everybody has, the whole church has to be here.
Yeah, it's just, you know, this is the church is assembling.
Yeah, that's kind of a side point, but, you know, it's one that I haven't thought that much about, but just kind of here over the past few years, I guess, to
Yeah.
say, which has been important to think about.
I don't know that we ever have 100% of the church here at any one time that I'm aware of, and I don't know that they did back in the first century. And, you know, if we start in those type things, you might say, okay, well, in an effort to get women to teach, we're going to leave somebody out all the time. It's kind of like the Supreme Court judge at the State of the Union address, you know, he's sitting out, you know, so we can do this. You know, we can't start going, you know, it's the assembly, the church has been called together, you know, we're all here, anybody that can be here. I mean, I think I was finishing up, go ahead.
It's like, let me see if I can ask it like this, and I agree, I think everybody understands that, you know, but like Thursday night, you know, when Gerald did the lesson here, would we say the whole church came together then?
I wouldn't think so.
And I wouldn't either, you know, but there was a lot of people here, but it wouldn't, through a specific reason when people come together, some couldn't be here for other obligations, I understand, maybe sickness and other things, but I don't think that the whole church is coming together then.
Yeah, that was a class, and it was a situation where it was supposed to be at somebody's home, but it was here. But anyway, it's I believe that is a different situation. Now, if the elders did call the assembly and say, we're having this study, we want everybody to be here, then to me, that's different. That's calling an assembly. Yeah, George.
I think the church is assembled right now. East Alabama is assembled right here, right now. There's something not here. Gerald run out of gas this morning, didn't make it. And Johnny did too. There's some back there in the class, but all are here that's coming at this particular service. And the church is assembled now.
That's not right, George.
Well, that gets into my second point here. What about a Bible class such as this in this room, where the whole congregation is not present? And so for some that may be watching or listening or whatever, you know, we have a large Bible class here, but the entire church is not in this room. You've got younger kids and some, you know, older ones teaching them that are in the back. We're split up. And so you don't have the entire congregation meeting at this instance. You know, the way I see that is that this is not an assembly worship. And so I believe a woman could ask a question here. Now, I don't believe a woman could teach this class or try to take over the class or be any way get out of her role as being submissive. But as far as asking a question in this part here, I believe a woman could. And one reason I say that is, you know, we've got different people speaking right now. As I speak, we've got 3 or 4 or 5 other people back there speaking. And so if this was going to be the assembly, if we are assembled, then I think it would be wrong for them to be back there talking while I'm talking. If we counted this as an assembly, when we go back and read these other things.
Why wouldn't theirs be the assembly?
Yeah.
Why does it always have to be the assembly?
Yeah, I mean, you've got a man back there teaching a classroom with boys and girls. You have the girls answering the question. If it's wrong in here, it's wrong back there for that young lady to speak up.
That'd be the definition of disorder.
Exactly.
That'd be as disorderly as you can get.
So.
Assembly, but it can't be an
We're out of time. George, you have something else you want to say before we close? I mean, we can discuss this. If you have any questions or anything, I've got some more things I want to discuss, so I'll be more than happy to discuss this in more depth if somebody wants to next week. But do you have anything to say, George, before we close up? Okay. Well, just think about those things. I've got a couple of other different scenarios here, and as I said, I've talked to some other people. These are not hypotheticals. Sometimes we get off and we say, well, we make up this situation that's very rare, and it's kind of like the man getting killed on the way to be baptized. Is he going to, these are things that are happening right now and that we have witnessed recently. And so, these are not hypotheticals. And so I've got 2 or 3 more that I want to discuss there. We'll discuss this in more detail if somebody wants to, as far as the class here. And as I said, anybody have any other questions or anything, just feel free to get with me during the week, and we'll do our best to address those. So I appreciate everyone's attention and participation. Thank you.